my name is Nae Al-Malik. I'm here today with Dr. Sheena Howard. We will be discussing her book, Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation. So how are you doing today?
I'm good. Good to be here. Thank you.
Great. We're love to have you. So my first question for you is, when did you gain your interest in comics?
It was around 2008. I really got into the Boondocks comic strip. And I had to write my dissertation at Howard University when I was doing my PhD in intercultural and rhetorical communication. So naturally, I wanted to combine something that would allow me to do some rhetorical analysis, but also allow me to use my graphic design master's degree. So I decided to focus on the Boondocks comic strip. But previous to that, I wasn't really into comics. I wasn't really an avid reader of comics until the Boondocks just kind of caught me and grabbed me, and I really liked it and really wanted to show people the positive and negative aspects of the strip for the community.
Okay, so now you did reference that Boondocks is one of the things that helped you gain your interest. So what are some of the issues and the topics that you speak about in your book?
Well, I talk about gender representation in the book. I talk about Black masculinity as depicted in Black comic strips. We talk about cultural gatekeeping of the comics industry, so the different levels that artists have to go through in order to get their work published. And most importantly to me is at the beginning of the book, I talk about the history of Black comic strip artists. So comic strips that specifically focus on the African American community by Black artists, because a lot of the books about the history of comics don't really mention these artists that have paved the way for a lot of minority artists of color. So I think that's the most important aspect to me in the book, along with all the other chapters that people wrote in and contributed to.
Okay, now, so another question that I have for you is, a lot of people may argue that sometimes the topic of comic that you focus on is a little different in opposed to superheroes, which is a little more traditional. So why is it that you chose to gain your focus mainly on this?
Yeah, superheroes are the popular thing, especially now with all of the movies, Captain America, we have a Black Panther movie coming out soon, Avengers. So those are like the popular things that are out right now. But my interest is in the comic strip because it's an understudied area of communication and an area of comics. And also I think comic strips with the political commentary, and especially the historical aspect of political commentary, especially for the African American community, is a rich place to learn about, you know, what was going on in history and what's going on today.
Okay, so now another question I have for you that may be a little bit off the books. Are you able to maybe share with me which is maybe your favorite chapter that you've written personally in the book?
My favorite chapter,
Could be all of them.
Yeah,
you know?
I wrote part of the introduction. I wrote the first chapter, and I wrote chapter 9. I say my favorite chapter that I wrote was probably the first chapter where I talk about the history of Black comic strip artists, because it's really highlighting those people that I want to be highlighted that are not highlighted in other books. I think for the book in general, my favorite chapter would probably be the chapter on social media economics, because it really talks about how the African American community used the internet as a social movement to get recognition, to publish their work when they couldn't get published in newspapers and when they couldn't get hired at DC and Marvel. So I think that's one of my favorite chapters, but it's hard to choose.
Yeah. Now, so you did say that there is a situation where a lot of times it's a little harder for certain people to be portrayed, and that's the reason why you highlight them in your book. So do you feel as though there's a market for superheroes of other ethnicities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like there is. I mean, I feel like historically comics have been targeted and marketed to white males, and they haven't spent money or resources target marketing other ethnicities. And so the myth has always been, well, you know, Hispanics or Black females or Asians don't like comics, but that's exactly what it is. It's a myth. So I think now the comics industry is starting to see that, yeah, we can market to these people. We need to market to these people because everybody actually likes comics. I think the problem was that those communities weren't being marketed to. For example, at New York Comic-Con a couple of months ago, they did a panel on diversity in comics, and they had a bunch of artists from DC and Marvel speaking at this panel. And one of the artists said, you know, we finally have a Muslim superhero called Miss Marvel, and she was like, and people are actually buying it. And I'm like, well, yeah, they're buying it. Just because you never had it doesn't mean people didn't
That it wouldn't
want
be
it.
relevant
So
now, right?
yeah, so it's still people are operating off of this myth that other target markets don't want it, and it's simply not true.
Okay, so now you did speak that that's simply not true, and that people can be marketed. So could you let me know who are some of the artists that you speak of in your book necessarily that really grabbed your attention, and maybe why you chose to speak of them?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of people I mentioned in the book, and a lot of people that I didn't, that I wish I could have mentioned in the book. But some of the people that I introduce readers to is Broomstick Brandon, Barbara Brandon, Ted Shearer, of course Aaron Magruder. So mostly comic strip artists that have paved the way and that had some political commentary in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but also in the 30s and 40s. So we talk about Orrin Evans in the first chapter of the book too, who was the creator of the first black comic book, All Negro Comics. So a myriad of people that comic fans who are usually fans of superheroes may not be familiar with.
Right. So now, the main purpose of your book is to solely inform people of some comic strips or some comic artists who are not recognized on a normal basis. And you collaborated with so many amazing people with this book. So how is it that you were able to gain your relationships and pull these people in to help you collaborate to write this?
Yeah, a lot of it was the internet. A lot of it was, you know, social media. So there's still a lot of people in the book that I've never met. I've just talked to online. And there are some people as I do this work that I actually have met. But my second editor, Ronald Jackson, he actually was a great resource in reaching out to some big names like Nancy Goldstein, John Jennings, William Foster in contributing to this book. So it was a really collaborative effort.
Okay. Now, as it was a large collaborative effort, and you did speak that you had to reach out to some of these people, was there anyone that you knew maybe prior to writing the book with your collaborations, or someone that really helped with your inspiration to start this book?
Yeah, actually none of the contributors in the book, I didn't know any of them. The only person I really knew was the second editor, Ronald Jackson. And together we just reached out to these people. So I actually really didn't know most of the people 90% of the people that contributed to the book.
So while these people did contribute to the book, do you feel as though you learned a lot from them while they were helping you? And maybe what was like one of the favorite things that you did learn in the process of your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I learned how important this work is because when I was doing my dissertation on the Boondocks comic strip in 2008, I don't think it was a well-respected topic. I think that a lot of people were just like, oh, she's doing that comics thing and that's going to be the end of it. So I think the people that I met and their gratitude and appreciation for the work that I created really lets me know that, you know, I'm doing good work, speaking for social justice in many ways with the topics that we're talking about around representation. So it really encourages me and motivates me. And a lot of the people that contributed to this book and that we talk about are lifelong comic fans, and so they've really embraced me as someone that's talking about comics from an academic perspective and someone that hasn't necessarily been a fan since childhood.
Right. Now, something that really interests me that you spoke of earlier, you said you had to reach out to about 90% of the people to help you with the collaborations on the book. So I want to know solely so that other 10%, you know, had to come from somewhere. So I would assume it was you. So what was your main approach to really writing this book prior to some of those collaborations that came in?
So when I was writing my dissertation on the Boondocks comic strip, part of the things that you have to do is write a literature review, just, you know, review the history of some aspect of your topic. So I wanted to write the history of Black comic strip artists specifically. So I went to the library. I thought I was just going to grab a couple books that named some of these artists that I was looking for. and I couldn't find one book, one go-to book that kind of listed out in a historical fashion the contributions of Black comic strip artists. So I had to pull a lot of things from the internet, from journal articles, and just piece together this history on my own. And so that was the real impetus for writing this book. Once I finished my dissertation, I was like, you know, I have to at least do something about this. I have to at least preserve this history. And so once I finished my dissertation, I just made it a point to write this book, and it was my first book, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I had the help of, again, Ron Jackson as a second editor, and made it happen. Took a few years for it to be published, got a lot of rejections, but eventually it went through.
All right, so when you say that it takes you a few years, and of course everyone knows that when you're writing a book, a lot of times you do have to go through a couple editors, and you do have to jump over a lot of people.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because now you are a success, and you are, for those of you at home, Dr. Sheena Howard is the 2014 Eisner Award winner, just so we can add that in. Just make sure you get that across. So with your book, maybe what was one of the first things that really entertained you? Because you speak of how there was no history, you couldn't find anything that listed it out, and you date back extremely far back in your book. So maybe what were some of the things that you could connect with some present day comics to some older comics?
Yeah, I did a lot of connecting like the past to the present, especially in the Boondocks chapter I did. It's called Race, Gender, in the Boondocks. One of the theories that I used was the cool pose, which is kind of a framework that talks about Black masculinity, and it connects some of the cool behaviors that African American males use today, and it connects it back to the, you know, the oppression in American history and how African American males use these cool behaviors to cope within an oppressive society. So I was using contemporary comics to talk about some of these historical elements of Black cultural experience, and to show that these ideas still connect today, the same way that they did in the 50s, 60s, 70s. There are still coping mechanisms that we have to use in order to deal with, you know, day-to-day racism, sexism, and things like that.
Right. So now in the first half of our segment, we only have about a minute or so left. So I'm just going to ask you something to tie up off the top of your head, because this is a little something we like to do. What could you let me know? What was your favorite thing that you found in the history? Maybe what was one of your favorite topics?
My most favorite thing that I actually don't really talk about it in this book, but what I wanted to do originally with this book was talk about what comic strips were saying during the civil rights movement. And so now I'm starting to do more research on that. And I think that's a very interesting and rich area to study, to see the political commentary and actually Black leadership in comics, as opposed to, like, you know, Martin Luther King and, you know, the Black church and folk songs that people were singing during the civil rights movement. I think comic strips had a lot to say as counter discourse and to challenge white supremacy during the 50s. And so I think that's the most interesting area that I'm going to study going forward.
Okay. So, so in other words, maybe the way that back in the day things came across, a lot of artists may portray them in like a comic strip necessarily. Is that what you're like referring to? That's what you enjoy about the comic strips back then? It's kind of like educational.
Yeah, it's kind of educational, and it's historical, so we can learn a lot about history through the comic strips that are archived from the Chicago Defender, from the Pittsburgh Courier newspapers. The history is all there, and the counter discourse for African Americans during the 50s is there.
I would love to, you know, talk more and to find out a little more about the history, but unfortunately we are coming up on our break.
Okay.
So we hope you guys stay tuned, and when we come back, we're going to continue our discussion.
Awesome.
Hey guys, it's Nae from LaSalle's very own TV show, Q&A. I'm here on North Campus asking random students trivia questions. Let's see how well they do today. Which rainforest produces 1/5 of the world's oxygen?
I believe it to be the Amazon rainforest.
And that is correct. Name the 7th planet from the sun.
Uranus.
That is correct. What is the capital of Spain?
Is it Barcelona?
It's actually Madrid. Only one sex with a mosquito bites. Is it the male or the female?
It's the female.
That's right. Which chess piece can only move diagonally?
The bishop.
That's correct. The Dewey Decimal System is used to categorize what?
Books.
That is correct. Be sure to check us out on social media and watch new episodes of LaSalle's favorite TV game show, Q&A, Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m., only on LaSalle TV and YouTube. And remember to never stop exploring.
Welcome back, and we thank you for sticking with us during our short commercial break. So we're going to go ahead and continue our conversation. So now I'm going to just jump back a little bit to what we were speaking of prior to the break, and we were just talking a little bit about history and how it is portrayed in some of the comic strips. Is there any way that you could give me maybe just an example? You did reference church, and maybe like a newer example from like the 90s when that was a large cultural time, especially in hip hop, which I also know is one of the topics that you focus on.
Yeah, so you mean like an example of history being present in a contemporary comic strip?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Boondocks, which is why I really liked it, was a comic strip that connected a lot of history into a contemporary conversation. So, for example, one of the characters' names is Huey. Huey is a spin off of Huey Newton. And so that particular comic strip actually kind of persuaded me to look more into who Huey Newton was and what he had done. The school that Huey and Riley go to is actually called Hoover Elementary. Hoover was, the head of the FBI, did some really bad things during the civil rights movement to some black leaders spying and stuff like that. So that propelled me to look more into who Edgar Hoover was and that whole COINTELPRO with the FBI thing in the past. So a lot of those different significations in the comic strip connected back to history that a lot of young people don't know about.
Now, I've gotten to know you a lot over the past few months, and we do talk about Boondocks a lot. A lot of times when we're together, Boondocks is one of the examples that we give to help bring it to present day. Now, me personally, I can accept my ignorance. I did not know that Boondocks was a comic strip before it was a cartoon, because sometimes in my generation, unfortunately, that happens. So in chapter 9, you talk about cool pose in the reference in Boondocks. So what exactly is cool pose?
Well, cool pose is like the walk that President Obama has. Cool pose is the way that a black male will shake another black male's hand. Cool pose, if we're talking from a historical perspective, is black males playing the dozens, which is basically verbal insults and who can be the most offensive but without losing your cool. Cool pose is kind of like a training ground for black men to cope with things like being pulled over by a police officer and having to remain cool so that you don't get shot down. A lot of what we're seeing today, and we can see that cool pose was created in the 90s, but it's still relevant today. It's the idea that you have to remain cool even if someone calls you the N-word. You have to remain cool even if a white police officer pulls you over for no reason. And we see those behaviors in the Boondocks comic strip, and I'm sure you could apply cool pose to a lot of other forms of black entertainment and see those things come out in a contemporary time period.
All right, now see, that's very interesting because I didn't know that there was necessarily like a way to group the certain behaviors into like a cool pose. That's what it's called. So what do you think that cool pose can necessarily tell us about a male, and how is it represented in the black comics as a drawing and as through artists?
Yeah, I mean, cool pose, it tells us a lot, especially when it comes to relationships, male-female relationships more specifically in the work of the cool pose. So black males have to remain tough. They have to have this tough image, and this tough image is hard to be turned off when you go home to your girlfriend or your wife. You're not supposed to have that emotionless, tough image with your significant other. However, because of the oppressive, restrictive society that black males live in, and the odds are stacked against a lot of them, they can't turn it off when it comes to male-female relationships, and it causes a lot of problems in the community.
So now we did talk about how cool pose, how it can be portrayed in the community and also how you can be portrayed in a comic strip.
Yeah.
So how do you think that they portray it differently, maybe through a comic strip versus TV or film, or do you feel as though there is a difference even?
I think that Coolpo specifically can be portrayed by black males in film, TV, comic strips. I don't think that it's necessarily different. I think the comics medium and TV are different. For example, there's the Boondocks animated show and then there's the Boondocks comic strip. And if you look at both of them, you see that they're very different. You almost can't recognize that Aaron Magruder is behind both of them because the comic strip doesn't mention the N-word at all, but the animated television show on Adult Swim mentions the N-word all the time. So I think when it comes to the comic strip, I think artists have more control over drawing and writing, especially if they're doing the drawing and writing themselves, which Aaron Magruder did a lot as a student at the University of Maryland working on the strip. But I think when it comes to television, you have a whole production crew. You have people that are voicing these characters, and so there are a lot of different hands in producing this form. So even though the Boondocks is the same form in the comic strip and the television show, it really has a different function, and it really says two very different things because of the constraints and the liberties of both of those mediums.
So now that you mention it, I have actually been, trying to distinct the difference between Boondocks the comic strip because, like I said, I wasn't aware of that.
Right.
And a lot of your work, like we do speak of, is representation. For example, it's in the subtitle of your book. So I have noticed that representation is very important to you, and that is something you speak of. So would you let me know a little bit of why that's important to you?
Yeah, I mean, representation is important to me because when you look at history, you see that entertainment is a very powerful force that has the ability to change the psyche and the way that people communicate and with you and the way that people think about you. So, for example, Jim Crow, we know about the Jim Crow laws in the segregated South, but Jim Crow really started as a song and a dance. So it started as entertainment, and then it turned into public policy. So when we talk about representation, we don't want those same things to be happening in the 21st century, where racist ideologies turn into public policy, which we see subtly today still. But also the way that a group is represented influences how people communicate with you. So if the prime representation of a black female, such as myself, is the angry black female, that's going to influence how people treat me and how people communicate with me, especially for people that don't have a lot of black female friends or don't come from a community where there's a lot of successful black females. And so it's very important.
So I really like how you decided to, give me an example that would bring it broader to like the angry black female. Now, that is something that a lot of times, as a black female, it does get you a little uptight. Why do I have to be angry because I'm a black female? That's not right.
Right.
So we only have a couple more minutes left in this segment, so we're about to wrap up, but I want to know necessarily, how do you feel about the way that present day comic artists maybe portray some older issues in their art? How does that differ from how someone back in the day would write their art?
I think today, I'm just going to answer this like a broad question. I think today in media, particularly television, we have a lot of variety. We have a lot more representations of particularly the African American community on the male and female side. However, I think in comics, we are very far behind because people haven't paid much attention to comics except for within recent years with the movies. So I think comics are way behind in a critical critique of representation. I think people are just now starting to critique the lack of representation in comics. So comics still have a way to go in visibility and representation and positive representations and a variety of representations of a lot of different people. We still don't have, a Hispanic superhero. We have Spider-Man, one of the Spider-Man storylines, Spider-Man is Hispanic and black, but we still don't have we still don't have a lot of things that we need to see in comics because comics haven't been critiqued the way movies or film has been critiqued.
Right. So when you speak of critiques and you do a lot of research evidently to create a book of this caliber. So what I'm wondering is, what are some of your current research projects that you're working on of any topic necessarily right now?
I'm working on a bunch of different things. One of the directions I think I'm going to go in is, the comics and hip hop area, looking at how hip hop was commodified and commercialized, and also looking at how comics follow that same trajectory of being commodified and then commercialized once they reach mainstream television, for example, like the Boondocks television show. Also, my research is in sexual identity negotiation and formation, so I want to do some things around LGBT representation, the queer of color community as well, and maybe bridging the gap between comics and my research on queer identity as well.
Okay, so you did share a lot of things today. I wish I could find. I'm actually having trouble finding the words, as you at home can see. I wish that we could, continue and go a little deeper. Unfortunately, we only have about a minute left to speak. So, is there anything that you want to let the people at home be aware of? Is there any information about yourself or upcoming projects, past projects? This is your time to tell me and the people at home anything you want to let us know.
Yeah, I would like people to follow me on Twitter at Dr. Sheena Howard. Go to my website, sheenachoward.com. You can find out a lot of the things I've been doing in the community. A lot of my speaking engagements are on my calendar on the website. My second book was Black Queer Identity Matrix towards an integrated color, queer of color framework. And my third book is Critical Articulations of Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. And so I really would like people to check out more of my work.
All right, so we can have people check out more of your work, of course, and so especially through your Twitter, or then they're able to reach. Soon they'll be able to reach your LinkedIn also through your Twitter, which is actually a better way for people to gain a little deeper information through LinkedIn, especially through people that she has worked with and people that have connected with her. Now, unfortunately, we do have to cut this segment to an end, Dr. Howard. I would love to speak with you a lot longer and about more and to learn more.
Yeah.
But we'd like to thank you for joining us today and for your interest in this topic. And for the people at home, we are more than happy to have you learn a lot more, because as we have spoke about today, this is a topic that a lot of times has gone maybe under the carpet and a lot of people did not get to learn about. So thank you, and we hope you join us again soon.